The stars above Keelan Station did not blink. They burned, cold, indifferent, permanent, and David Mercer had long since stopped finding comfort in them. He sat on the floor of cell block 9 with his back against the curved alloy wall, knees pulled to his chest, listening to the ventilation cycle hiss in the dark. His left arm was wrapped in the gray fiber bandage the Veth medic had applied 3 weeks ago after the experiment. It itched. It had itched every hour of every day since. The itch was not a healing itch. It was something else. Something that moved. Keelan Station was not a prison, technically. The Veth Dominion had not built it as one. They had built it as a research installation. A clinical, precise word for a place where humans had been brought by the thousand after the Reach War. Where they were catalogued and studied, and altered in small ways the Veth assured one another were not cruel because cruelty required empathy. And the Veth had run the numbers on human neural architecture, and determined that what felt like suffering to a human was simply high-frequency distress, signaling with no philosophical weight behind it. They were wrong about that. They had been wrong about a great many things. Davin had been on the station 11 months. He knew this because he had scratched a line into the alloy beside his bunk, for every morning he woke to the amber cycle light, and he had 141 scratches as of yesterday. He was 26 years old. He had been a machinist's apprentice on the colony ship Alethea when the Veth interceptors had come out of the dark between the second and third planets of the Sira system, and in the 12 minutes it took for the Alethea to realize it could not run and could not fight, David Mercer had watched the ship's senior machinist die at a console and had quietly finished the man's last calibration because there had been nothing else to do. That was who he was. That was what he did. When things broke, he fixed them. When there was nothing to fix, he sat still and kept his hands busy and waited. His hands were not quiet now. He unwrapped the bandage slowly in the dark, more by feel than sight. The medic came every 3 days. The medic was not unkind exactly. It was more that kindness was a concept that required a framework the Veth simply hadn't been given. The medic pressed instruments against Davin's arm, recorded data, reapplied the bandage, and left without speaking, because what was there to say? The arm looked wrong. It had looked wrong since the third procedure. There was a ridge along the radius bone, a slight asymmetry in the forearm's profile, a faint luminescence that wasn't quite bioluminescence, and wasn't quite scar tissue, and wasn't anything that belonged inside a human body. The Veth had put something in there. He didn't know exactly what. He knew it hurt when he got angry. A deep, searing pain like a welding torch applied from the inside, and he knew it got worse when he was afraid. And he knew that twice in the last month he had woken from nightmares to find the bandage sliced clean through from the inside and his bunk sheets cut, as though by a very fine and very sharp blade. He had not told the medic about that. He wrapped the arm back up, tight, methodical. He worked the cloth in a specific pattern he'd developed over the weeks. Over, under, pull, smooth, the way he used to wrap a torque driver grip before a long shift. It gave his hands something to do. It kept him calm. Calm was the only tool he had left. The cell door unsealed at the third bell of the amber cycle, the way it always did, because the Veth believed in routine the way other species believed in gods. The corridor was lit in that deep violet gray the Veth preferred, a color that sat uncomfortably on human eyes, and Devon walked its length the same way he always walked it. Hands in pockets, shoulders level, eyes forward. While around him the other humans in the research block shuffled to the common area for their nutrition allocation. There were 41 humans in Block 9. Davin knew all their names. He had made a point of learning them in his first weeks, not because he was sentimental, but because it seemed like something that mattered. Knowing the names of the people you were imprisoned with. There was Yeva, who had been an atmospheric engineer on Sira 3 before the war, and who now spent most of her time watching the Veth through narrowed eyes and cataloging their behaviors in a small notebook she'd made from fiber wrappers. There was old Prem, who'd been 60 when they came aboard the transport, and who was 61 now, and who every morning, regardless of everything, made a small low sound that Devon eventually recognized as humming, the same 5 notes, over and over, so soft the Veth audio sensors didn't register it. And there was Kale, who was 17, and who had never been anything but a prisoner, and who sometimes looked at the walls with an expression that Davin recognized as particular despair of someone who couldn't imagine the world being any other way. Davin sat across from Kale in the common area and said nothing. He ate his nutrient block. He drank the water, which tasted of the station's recycling systems, a faint mineral flatness. Outside the high porthole, the stars did not blink. The Veth Overseer, Designation 7, moved along the perimeter of the room in its customary patrol. 3 steps, pause, 3 steps, pause. The tall blue-gray carapace of its body catching the violet light in that unsettling way. Its lower eye cluster scanning the room while the upper cluster processed data from the wall panels. Designation 7 had been overseeing Block 9 for as long as Davin had been there. It was not cruel. It was not kind. It was a manager reviewing inventory, and the inventory happened to breathe. Davin watched it from beneath his brow. He had been watching it for 11 months. He knew its patrol pattern. He knew its response latency. 3 seconds from stimulus to action, which was slow for a Veth, suggesting Designation 7 was either aging or assigned to this block specifically because it was considered low priority. He knew its shift change came at the 6th bell of the Amber cycle, and that in the 4-minute window between when it left and its replacement arrived, the door to Subcorridor 12 was on a passive lock that could be defeated by anyone who understood Veth magnetic latch mechanics. And Don did, because he had spent 3 months memorizing the maintenance panels they let him clean in exchange for extra water rations. And the latches on those panels were the same model as the latches on the doors. He knew all of this. He had known it for 6 weeks. He had not moved on it, because moving on it alone was not enough. Moving on it alone got you to the transport bay and no further, and the transport bay required a pilot, and the only pilot in Block 9 was Yeva. And Yeva's right hand had been damaged in the initial capture, in a way the Veth medics had not repaired because her piloting ability had not been what they wanted from her. And Davin had spent the last 3 weeks, quietly, invisibly, teaching Yeva to grip a control stick with her left hand using a piece of alloy tubing he'd shaped in the maintenance bay. He had also been watching the arm. On the 38th day after the procedure, he had gotten very angry. Not the hot, impulsive anger of fear, but the cold, deliberate anger he summoned when he needed to know something. And the pain in his arm had peaked, and something had pressed against the skin of his wrist from the inside, something thin and very sharp, and he had sat perfectly still, and breathed very slowly and felt it retract. He had spent a long time thinking about that. Not with horror. The horror had already been used up. With the focused, patient attention he'd have given a complicated machine, a thing had been put inside him. The thing was sharp. The thing responded to certain internal states. These were engineering facts. The question was whether engineering facts could be put to use. The answer, he was increasingly sure, was yes. 3 things happened in the next week that changed the timeline. The first was that Designation 7's replacement arrived early, not its shift replacement. A different overseer entirely, a larger unit with a faster eye cluster and a patrol pattern that overlapped the previous blind spots in Subcorridor 12. The Veth had noticed something. Davin didn't know what. The second was that Kale was selected for a procedure. Davin saw the medic arrive with the secondary team and watched Kale's face go the particular pale it went when something was about to happen to him. And Kale looked at Davin across the common area, and Davin held the boy's gaze and gave one short nod, the same nod he used to give young apprentices before a difficult task. "I see you. I'm here. This is doable." And Kale straightened up a small amount and they took him away. He came back, but he came back quieter. Whatever they had put in the procedure, it had taken something out. The third was that Yeva found him in the maintenance corridor and pressed his hand once and said, very quietly, "I can do it. Left hand. I practiced on the dummy panel. I can do it." That was Thursday, by Davin's count. He said, 3 days. She said, "Why 3? He said, "Because I need to know if I can do what I think I can do, and I need 1 day to test it and 1 day to recover and 1 day to move." She looked at his arm. She was the only one he had told about the arm. She had not told him he was wrong to be thinking what he was thinking, which was one of the reasons he'd told her. She said, "Does it hurt?" He said, "Yes." She said, "Okay." He went to the maintenance bay alone during the 3rd bell work period when Designation 8, the new overseer, was at the far end of its patrol. He stood at the secondary panel, facing the wall, and he did not close his eyes because he had learned that closing his eyes made it harder to control. And he reached for the cold, deliberate anger, the machinist's anger, the anger of a man who has held a broken thing in his hands for too long and finally decided to fix it. The pain came immediately. It always did. It started deep in the radius, a white searing that spread up toward the elbow and down toward the wrist, and the thing inside moved, pressed, sought. He breathed through it. He held the anger at a specific temperature, not hot, not impulsive, just steady and focused, the way you held a torch to a weld point. and he felt his wrist push harder, and he felt his skin stretch, and then something came through. He looked down. It was approximately 30 centimeters. It was thin as a stylus, and appeared to be made of something that was not quite metal and not quite bone, and was absolutely catastrophically sharp. He could tell this by the way the light moved on its edge, not reflecting but ending, as though the edge simply stopped existing in the conventional dimension. It emerged from the inner surface of his wrist and curved very slightly upward, and the pain was extraordinary, and he was shaking with it, and he held it for 6 seconds, and then let the anger cool, and it retracted, slowly, back through the skin, which sealed behind it without bleeding. He stood with his forehead against the alloy panel. His eyes were wet, not from grief, from the sheer physical shock of it. He allowed himself 5 seconds of that, and then he straightened up and unwrapped the bandage and rewrapped it. Over, under, pull, smooth, and thought about what he'd learned. It was real. It was controllable, more or less. He'd kept it out for 6 seconds, which was better than the accidental eruptions in his sleep. It hurt, but manageable hurt was not the same as incapacitating hurt, and he had a machinist's relationship with pain, which was that you noted it, filed it, and continued working. The blade was real and it was his, more or less, in the way a tool you've been given without asking is still yours if you're willing to pick it up. He spent the recovery day very still, eating carefully, drinking his water, watching the new overseer's patrol pattern, and updating his mental map. He said very little. Prem's 5-note hum moved through the common area in the evenings like something alive. Old Yeva counted her notebook pages. Kale sat quietly in the corner with the new quietness that had been put in him. And Davin sat next to him and said nothing in particular, just sat there, 2 people in a room, the way people sometimes needed to be. On the 3rd day, Davin Mercer did the thing. It started at the 2nd bell of the violet cycle, which was the deepest dark of the station's simulated night, when the patrol had its lowest staffing and the human block was at its quietest. He had told 6 people, Yeva, Kale, Prem, 3 others whose skills he had calculated were necessary, a woman named Soren, who'd been a 0G medic before the war, and who had quietly maintained that capability by exercising her hands against resistance for 11 months. A man named Holt, who was large and patient, and who had once mentioned, in passing, that he'd done a stint on a security detail, and a young woman named Bess, who had been, in her previous life, an electrical systems tech, and who had confirmed for Devon, in a conversation that appeared to be about nothing in particular, that yes, she had noticed the same thing about the passive lock on sub-corridor 12. And yes, she thought she could pop it without triggering the secondary alarm, provided someone could give her about 40 seconds of distraction. He had not told them about the arm. He would show them if necessary. He hoped it would not be necessary. The passive lock took Bess 38 seconds. She did it with a piece of fiber wrapper and a modified cleaning tool, and her hands did not shake. Sub-corridor 12 opened onto the secondary maintenance spine, which ran behind the living quarters for 600 meters, before terminating at the junction that connected to the transport bay annex. The spine was automated, no Veth personnel, just sensors. And Davin had spent 11 months learning where the sensors were not. The gaps between coverage zones where a human-sized body, moving at a specific pace, created no alert signature. He led them through, 6 people single file, 3 seconds between each person, through the dark of the spine, which smelled of coolant and the specific metallic nothing of recycled air, which he had grown so accustomed to that he barely noticed it. And somehow that was the thing that hit him in the chest as he walked. The fact that he barely noticed it, that 11 months had made this alien smell the smell of somewhere familiar, and he thought, not anymore. After tonight, not anymore. They were 4 minutes from the transport annex when the alarm went. Not the soft secondary alarm that Bess had avoided. The primary alarm, a pulsing resonant tone in the Veth frequency range that made the inside of Davon's skull vibrate unpleasantly, paired with the amber cycling of the spine's emergency lighting. Davin stopped, held up a fist. The 6 people behind him stopped. He counted 3 seconds of the alarm. Then he said very quietly, "Someone trigger it behind us or ahead." Holt said, "Behind. I think behind," which meant the head was clear, which meant they had time possibly. Minutes, not hours. Davin said, "Move, move now, don't stop." He ran. He hadn't run in 11 months. His body remembered how. The corridor blurred past, and he didn't think about the alarm or the Veth response time, or the fact that they were 6 unarmed humans in the maintenance spine of an alien research station with no one coming to help them, because thinking about that was not useful, and useful was the only register he had left. He thought about the junction. He thought about the secondary hatch. He thought about Yeva's left hand on a control stick. They made the junction. The secondary hatch was sealed. Active lock, not passive, full Veth security encoding. Bess looked at it for 1 second and said flatly, "No." Davin said, "Stand back." They stood back. He stood in front of the hatch and he reached for the anger. Not the cold, controlled anger this time. He didn't have time for cold and controlled. He reached for something hotter and more honest. The accumulated anger of 11 months and 141 scratches in an alloy wall, and Kale's face going pale and the weight of a dead machinist's last calibration, and every person in Block 9, whose name he had learned because someone should, because that mattered, and the pain came like a blade through fire, and his arm screamed, and the thing came out of his wrist, 30 centimeters of whatever the Veth had put inside him, and he drove it into the hatch's lock mechanism and felt it cut through the Veth alloy the way a good blade cuts through nothing at all, and the hatch opened. Bess said very quietly, "Oh," Prem said something in a language Davin didn't know. It sounded like a prayer. Davin retracted the blade, slower this time, harder, his vision graying at the edges, and said, "Through go. Now." Transport Annex held 3 Veth short-range shuttles, 2 maintenance drones, and 1 decommissioned colonial light transport that the Veth had been using as a spare parts inventory and which Yeva, who had been an atmospheric engineer but had learned to fly everything with an engine as a matter of professional necessity, said she could fly even with a bad hand and no pre-flight checklist and a pursuit response coming in approximately 90 seconds. She said all of this while already in the pilot's cradle. Her left hand found the control interface with a certainty that had nothing improvised about it. Davin had watched her practice for 3 weeks on a dummy panel. Her left hand knew what it was doing. He took the co-pilot position not because he could fly. He couldn't, not well, but because he could read instruments, and Yeva was going to need someone to read instruments. The others strapped in. Holt sealed the annex door with a manual bar lock. Bess looked at the shuttle's secondary systems and said, "I can boost the drive output by about 15% if I reroute the heat exchange to the forward panels." And Davin said, "Do it," and she did it, because she was an electrical systems tech, and that was what she did. The annex bay doors opened on Yeva's command. She had the access code because she'd been watching the Veth use it for 11 months, the same way Davin had been watching everything. The same way all of them had been watching, accumulating data in the spaces behind their eyes, because that was the only space that was theirs. The shuttle moved. The pursuit came in under 2 minutes, which was faster than Davin had estimated, which meant the new overseer was better than he'd calculated, which was a relevant fact to file and nothing more. 2 Veth interceptors, fast and angular, the same design that had taken the Alethea 12 years ago. He recognized the silhouette in the rearview screen and felt something cold move through him that was not fear and not anger, but something older and quieter. Yeva's hands moved across the console, her left hand and her right hand, the damaged one, working together in a way that looked like it cost her, and that she was paying without complaint. She said, "I need you to tell me what the nav is reading." He read her the nav. She adjusted. The shuttle dropped into a lower orbital trajectory that put the station's own mass between them and one of the interceptors. A maneuver that was either genius or desperation or both, and that bought approximately 40 seconds. She said, "A relay beacon at the edge of the system. I know the frequency. If we can reach it," he said. "We can reach it," she said. "They're faster," he said. "I know," she said. "Devon," he said. "I know, Yeva." The second interceptor came around the station's far side, running hot, closing at a rate that the nav display expressed in numbers and that Devon's gut expressed as not enough time. He watched the numbers. He thought about the thing in his arm. He thought about the relay beacon. He thought about what Bess had said about the heat exchange reroute, and then he had an idea, and the idea was either very good or the stupidest thought he'd ever had, and he said, "Bess." From behind him, "What? The heat exchange you rerouted. Can you reverse it?" A pause. "Reverse it, the drive output drops, not the drive. Can you dump the heat exchange load as a directed emission, forward-facing? Everything the drive's been shedding." A longer pause. "That's not what it's designed for. I know it would produce a thermal burst about the size of, can you do it?" The shortest pause. "Yes. Tell me when you have the second interceptor directly astern." "Exactly astern," Yeva said. "What are you doing?" Davin said. "Fixing something." He watched the rearview screen. The second interceptor was fast. It was good. The pilot was good. It held a pursuit angle that accounted for the shuttle's movements. With the patient precision of a species that had been conducting pursuits longer than humans had been spacefaring. It was better than them at this. It was not better at this specific thing, at this specific moment. Now, exact astern now. Davon said, Bess. The heat exchange dumped. The thermal burst was not a weapon. It was a heat management system releasing accumulated thermal load in a single uncontrolled event, which produced a wall of superheated particulate approximately 40 meters across and about as dangerous to a shielded Veth interceptor as a very dramatic sunrise. The interceptor's sensors, however, were calibrated for the emissions of known human spacecraft, not for a colonial shuttle that had been substantially misused by an electrical systems tech in the last 4 minutes. And the sudden thermal event at close range triggered its collision avoidance response, which was automatic and non-negotiable, and which sent it into an evasive lateral burn that took it off pursuit vector for approximately 11 seconds. 11 seconds was enough. Yeva's hands moved. The relay beacon came onto the nav. The shuttle hit it at full burn. The signal went out. They picked it up at the Meridian Frontier Post, a small garrison of the Human Accord's 6th Fleet, which had been losing the war and knew it, and which had nevertheless maintained its relay listening posts, because someone had decided at some level that you kept listening even when you were losing, because the day you stopped listening was the day you stopped finding things worth hearing. The signal from Yeva's shuttle was detected by a comms specialist named Gara, who was 22 and 3 months into her first posting, and who almost missed it because it was coming in on an old colonial frequency that the fleet's automated systems had deprioritized. She did not miss it. She pulled it up manually, verified the source, and went to get her superior officer at a speed that had nothing to do with standard protocol. Rescue came in 19 hours. There was a debriefing afterward, which was long and careful, and conducted by people who took notes in the specific way that people who understand what they've just been given take notes. With intensity, with follow-up questions, with the particular attention of those who have been waiting a long time to learn something they needed to know. They were very interested in the arm. They were interested in the specifics of what the Veth had done and how, and what the result functioned like, and what the recovery parameters were. Devan answered every question. He answered them with the same care and precision with which he would have answered questions about a machine, because it was a machine, more or less, an engineered system that had been installed without consent and that he had chosen to understand and use rather than to fear. He didn't say this to the debriefers. He didn't need to. He sat in a room with light that did not pulse in the Veth frequency and breathed air that did not taste of recycling systems and answered every question they asked. Later, he sat alone in a room that had a window, and outside the window was a pale sky going amber with a sunset, which was the light of a real star on a real atmosphere, and the light moved and shifted the way light does when there's weather to push it, and he watched it for a long time without speaking. Kale came in at some point and sat next to him. The boy had the new quietness in him still, whatever the procedure had done, but underneath the quietness, there was something that had not been touched. Something stubborn and young and not quite broken. They sat for a while without talking. Davin said, "You're going to be all right." Kale said, "You don't know that." Davin said, "No, but that's what you say." Kale thought about this. He said, "Why?" Davin said, "Because sometimes saying a thing correctly is the first step to it being true." Kale didn't answer for a bit. Then he said, "That doesn't make any sense." Davin said, "I know." Kale almost smiled. It wasn't much of a smile. It was the first one Davin had seen from him since the procedure. He filed it. The arm was the thing, in the end, that the Accord's military researchers could not leave alone. They were not wrong to be interested in it. What the Veth had developed, what they had installed in Davin Mercer's arm without asking, as a test, as one of the many small alterations they conducted on the humans of Kelon Station in the belief that human distress had no philosophical weight, was something genuinely new, and genuinely theirs. A blade grown from biology and intent, and the specific metallurgic compounds the Veth synthesized from materials found in the human body's existing architecture. The Veth had intended it as a weapon, a controlled weapon implanted in a controlled subject for controlled testing. They had not anticipated the subject developing 11 months of meticulous, patient, completely invisible understanding of how to use it. They had not anticipated a machinist who studied things. The researchers asked Davin carefully if he would be willing to work with them, to help them understand what had been done, to inform a response. He said yes. He said it without hesitation, the way he would have said yes to any job that needed doing. But he asked for one thing first. He asked for the full population list from Keelan Station, all 4,963 names. He asked that they be cross-referenced with the Accord's missing persons database, and that letters, actual letters, not automated notifications, letters from a person, be sent to every surviving family and every surviving contact, telling them what the names meant, that these were not the lost but the known, that someone had them, that they were real. The researcher asked him why he wanted this specifically. He said, because someone should. The Veth Dominion, it should be noted, had conducted extensive biological and psychological profiling on the humans of Keelan Station. They had concluded, with the precision for which the Veth were known, that human beings were a species of moderate adaptability, limited technical innovation under stress, strong social bonding behaviors of no tactical significance, and an apparent tendency toward perseveration, the repetition of the same ineffective behaviors in the face of repeated failure, that the Veth researchers had noted with mild scholarly interest as one of humanity's more curious traits. They had not framed it as persistence, they had used the clinical term, which meant the same thing but with a flaw assumed. They were wrong about that, too. David Mercer spent the next 3 years working with the Accord's researchers. He spent them in rooms with instruments and questions, and the occasional necessary test that required him to summon the controlled anger and hold the blade out while people measured things. And he spent them studying everything the Veth had written about what they'd done, which was extensive. Because the Veth documented everything, and reading their documentation of their own procedures with the dispassionate attention of a machinist, reading a part schematic for a machine that had already been built, noting where their assumptions were wrong and where their conclusions were off, and where, in the margins of their careful data, you could see the places where they had not known what they were looking at. They had not known what they were looking at. The thing they had put in his arm was not, as they had theorized, a stress response mechanism that merely happened to produce a blade. It was, and he understood this slowly over months, the way you understand something complicated, when you take it apart piece by piece. An adaptive system, a biological machine that responded not just to anger and fear, but to intent, to the specific quality of focused purposefulness that the Veth had no equivalent concept for, and had therefore failed to model. It got better when he practiced. It got more precise. The pain decreased, not because he became accustomed to it, but because the system itself optimized. It was learning. The Veth had not expected that. They had not built it to learn. They had built it as a static implant. But human biology had done what human biology does. It had found the new thing, turned it over, decided it was part of the system now, and begun the process of integration. The researchers asked him if this concerned him. He said, no. They asked why. He thought about it. He thought about 11 months in Block 9, about 141 scratches, about Yeva's left hand finding the control interface without hesitation, about Kale almost smiling, about Prem's 5-note hum, so quiet the sensors missed it, about the specific way the amber light over a sunset moved, with weather behind it. He said, I've always been good at figuring out what a thing does and using it for something useful. This is just a thing. I'll figure it out. The researcher wrote something down. David Mercer went back to work. In the 42nd month after the escape from Keelan Station, the Accord's Intelligence Division produced a report noting that 3 separate Veth research installations had been found completely abandoned. Not destroyed, not evacuated under fire, simply empty. All personnel and data removed in what the analysts estimated had been an orderly and intentional withdrawal. The Veth, the report noted, had moved these operations further into their own space, deeper away from the contested frontier. The analysts proposed several explanations: supply line issues, command restructuring, strategic reorientation in response to Accord pressure. David read the report once. He thought about the Veth, about their careful data and their precise conclusions, and their absolute certainty that human distress had no philosophical weight. He thought about what it must have looked like to a species that ran numbers on everything, when the numbers started coming out wrong. He thought they might be afraid. He had no particular feeling about this. Not satisfaction, not gloating, not the HVI swagger of a species that had just proved itself. He was not built for that register. He was built for fixing things and for paying attention, and for knowing the names of the people around him. What he felt, if it was anything, was what a machinist feels when a thing that was broken starts to work correctly again. Not triumph, just the quiet satisfaction of a job moving in the right direction. He made a note in his working file, cross-referenced the abandoned facility locations against the original deployment maps from before the war, and poured himself a cup of water that tasted of nothing, which was how he liked it now, and got back to work.